Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome into a new episode of Capitol View, a weekly webcast brought to you by the Daily Journal and djournal.com, talking Mississippi government with Bobby Harrison, our Capitol Bureau Chief down in Jackson. I'm your host, Brad Locke, here on this Monday, the 6th of March. And how we doing, Bobby?
All right, Brad, how you doing?
Can't complain, sir. Sorry we're starting a little bit late here, but it seems like something always seems to happen. I'm going to try to get this thing started, Bobby. That delays things.
Yeah,
hopefully the connection.
It'd be ready by 2.
Yeah, aim for 1:30. Start at 2. And the Wi-Fi was acting up just as we were trying to get going. So hopefully we've got that resolved. But we've got plenty to talk about. Of course, this legislative session ongoing. A lot of bills dying or staying alive, moving forward in the chambers and whatnot. We're going to try to focus in on just a few of them here today. Let's start with a bill that has died since we last talked. Now, it's been almost a week, Bobby. A bill dealing with civil service protection would have removed it for several thousand state employees. So tell us a little bit about how that went down, Bobby, and why the opponents of it are glad it's gone.
Well, it would take state employees out from under the auspices of the Personnel Board, which is the mechanism that provides civil service protection in Mississippi, so that employees can't be fired for political reasons. The Republican leadership has been wanting to do this for some times. They say they need to remove the civil service protection to give the agency heads more flexibility in this tough budget time with declining state revenues. But the Democrats, with some help from Republicans, were able to kill it last week in the Senate Appropriations Committee. It was kind of a surprising vote, but it didn't get out of the committee. But it did not, so it's dead for the session.
Yeah, as you noticed, some Republicans kind of slid over there. Of course, Republicans have a super majority in both chambers after the last election. I'm kind of curious, Bobby, just kind of a general question. Has that super majority been as beneficial so far as they would have hoped? I mean, on something like this, you maybe thought that would be an advantage.
Yeah, I mean, on issues like this, there's still a certain number of Republicans who maybe don't want to go as far as the leadership wants to go. It definitely helped them last year on the major tax cut they passed for the tax cut for businesses and the cut on the individual income tax. But there's still they're still limited. They can't go as far, for instance, on charter schools as they wanted to go. There was Republicans that broke away from the leadership on that issue, and the same thing happened last week on the Personnel Board. There were in the House there were several Republicans who voted against that bill. It barely squeaked through on the House by just a 1 or 2 vote margin, and then in the Senate, I thought it might have some trouble on the floor, but I didn't think that it would die in the Appropriations Committee. But there was about 3 or 4 Republicans who voted with the Democrats on that issue, and so it didn't make it out of the committee by the deadline.
Let's talk about a bill that did get passed. Has to do with fantasy sports, actually, Bobby, regulating and taxing it. Could be a new source of revenue for the state. Of course, the state always looking for new revenue streams, given the sluggish tax collections we've mentioned countless times. This passed last Wednesday. Didn't really have much opposition, Bobby. How much are they hoping this can bring in?
Well, I mean, they don't really know. I mean, it's not going to bring in a lot when you talk about a $6 billion budget, and they're I think this month, last month, they were revenues were 25 million below projection, so it's not going to bring in a lot, but the estimates are maybe 2 to 5 million per year. Every state is in the process right now of putting regulations on fantasy sports, so there's really not anything to sort of judge by.
Right.
A couple of years ago, I think it started in New York. Brad, the Attorney General of New York, ruled that it was fantasy sports participation was the same as gambling.
Yeah.
And Attorney General here ruled the same thing. And so if it's gambling, it has to be approved and regulated by the legislature. And the 2016 session, that they passed legislation just allowing fantasy sports to continue in Mississippi, with the intent to put some more regulation in this year, and that's what they did. They put the same tax on it, 8%, that's on casinos, and it'll be regulated by the state gaming commission, and it will bring a little money into the state. And it's always dependent on it passed the House and Senate, and now it's waiting to signature Governor Phil Bryant.
I guess it's one of those that has the potential to be a growing revenue stream. I mean, fantasy sports just seems to get more popular every year. I mean, I don't play it, Bobby.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but seems like something that has that potential a little bit at least.
Yeah, it's apparently pretty popular, and there's some people that I think somebody in Mississippi won several $1,000s a few years ago playing, and you play it on the internet. I didn't know anything about it till last year when they started talking about it was gambling. But it's a popular sport. I was talking to somebody the other day that actually plays fantasy sports, but his fantasy sports plays fantasy sports on the British Premier Soccer League. So, yeah. so that's I guess you can play in just about any league across the world. And we think of playing I guess fantasy sports with a Major League Baseball or NFL National Football League, but I didn't know you could play with British Premier Soccer League. But that's one of the biggest sports leagues in the world, I guess. So
oh yeah,
so there you go.
I mean, you can do fantasy golf, fantasy tennis, hockey. I mean, pretty much anything. Fantasy NASCAR. Like I almost got into fantasy NASCAR one time, but thought better of it. Yeah. But yeah, it's a growing industry. I mean, they have like there are a whole like podcast and websites dedicated to fantasy gaming. Because if you're really into it, I mean, like really, really into it, A, you probably have too much time on your hands, but or you're just good at managing your time. But B, you've got to do your homework if you actually want to win in these leagues. It can be very competitive for sure. So that's a new.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah. I'm sorry. That was one reason that some people argue. That's one reason some people argue with the Attorney General's rulings and they're saying it wasn't gambling; it was more skill than say playing the slot machines or something other. But that was a ruling of the Attorney Generals in several states. So that's where we are. And Brad, another significant point about this bill going to the governor. This was one of the last vehicles alive that could have been a lottery could have been added to. So that means that probably the lottery is dead for this session. Finally, even though the governor's come out and said he wished they would find a vehicle to allow a vote on it. So
right,
but I don't see anything alive that could to do that. But who knows?
Well, don't put anything past lawmakers, Bobby.
That's true.
You never know.
I should know that.
You'll never know what they'll attach to a bill. Let's talk roads and bridges real quick. We talk about this seemingly every week. It's one of the biggest issues. I guess education funding is probably the number one issue, but roads and bridges might be number two because, I mean, we don't know that any resolution is going to come as far as getting extra funding, but it keeps coming up, Bobby, and, just trying to find different sources of revenue. So where do we stand on that? What's the latest?
Well, the latest, I mean, it happened late last week, and I'll probably get more information this week. Highlighted the problem. It was announced late last week that the federal government has come in and closed about 100 rural bridges across the state because of safety concerns. Yeah, and so that just kind of highlights the problem, and that issue is still alive. Still being debated in legislature, but there's not going to be a solution that addresses all the transportation problems in the state, but there's still a couple of things alive that could address some of
them. Yeah, I mean, we already know that the bill that would have forced online retailers to collect the 7% tax for online sales it would have been a source of revenue that died. I guess that actually, I don't know that we talked about that on here, Bobby. I want to say that happened like right after last week's episode. When Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves.
Yeah, everything happened.
I'm sure we talked about it on the Memo podcast, but I don't know if we talked about it on here since it actually happened. I mean, that was, that was going to be possibly a decent source of revenue.
Around $100 million a year, maybe.
And I know Tate Reeves basically. You can't say. I'm trying to remember what the terminology is, but it didn't get out of a committee, and Tate Reeves that kind of told everybody as such the day before that it wouldn't get out.
Yeah, we talked about this so many times, but there's a Supreme Court ruling already saying that you couldn't force a state could not force a company that did not have a brick and mortar building in that state to collect the sales tax, if you will, on the items that company sold online or through catalogs and whatnot. And so he said to try to force online retailers to collect that tax would be unconstitutional. So for that reason, he killed the legislation, or the Senate Finance Committee Chair, Joy Fillingham, killed a recommendation, but it was obvious that Tate Reeves was on board with that decision. And of course, the people who support the legislation say that, they want this issue to go back to the Supreme Court, and they feel that there'd be another, there might be another, the opinion might come out differently this time. Back when this opinion was issued in '92, the internet was just barely getting going. But Reeves said he said it was unconstitutional, and because of the Supreme Court ruling, that was the reason he gave for killing the legislation, which was the biggest, was the best chance to provide a steady revenue stream to improve transportation in Mississippi.
And the revenue stream that proponents of the bill said would come, Tate Reeves called it, quote, fake money.
Fake money, that's right, because of the Supreme Court ruling.
Right. Is that the same as monopoly money is my question.
Or Life. You ever play Life?
Yes, I have. Not good at that game either. So I mean, I guess there's really nothing that can be done right now much for roads and bridges. I think there's still that $50 million bond bill out there, isn't there?
Yeah, and that could, that turned into an important bill, especially with the fact that with the federal government coming in, as we said, and closing all those bridges, so that would definitely help with some local bridges if that gets through the Senate and is agreed to. And theoretically, they could still put more money. At this point, they could, make it $100 million bond bill if they saw fit. So that could be it'd be one-time money, but it could be a significant chunk to
Sure.
deal with the rural bridge problem. But and believe it or not, though, Brad, 50 million or 100 million, it's just experts say it's just scratching the surface of the money needed to deal with not only subpar rural bridges, but just subpar state bridges on state highways also across the state. So I mean, it's a major issue. And it's it's not dealt with. It doesn't appear it's going to be dealt with in a meaningful way this session, but it's going to come back in the 2018 session too.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, let's close out the webcast here with three things, Bobby, from this past week. Three things of note: most impactful lawmaker, most impactful piece of legislation, and the strangest thing to happen in the state capitol. Let's start with the most impactful lawmaker.
Well, I'm going to say. Going back to the personnel board, Willie Simmons, who happens to be the Transportation Committee Chair, this will be pertinent later on, but that he's a Transportation Committee Chair. But Willie Simmons made the motion in the Senate Appropriations Committee the motion to essentially kill the personnel board bill. He spoke against it, and when he made the motion, I didn't think he'd be successful, but he was able to carry enough votes to kill that bill, which was an important bill to the governor and the legislative leadership. So that was a pretty big deal.
All right, most impactful piece of legislation from the past week.
Well, you kind of messed me up on that one, Brad, because we talked about the bond. Bridge bill, but as I said, I'm going to stick with that. The bond bill for the local bridges, the rural, not only rural bridges, but the bridges could be in the cities too. Some of the, a lot of cities have problems with their bridges, but this $50 million bond bill, it with the fact that the federal government has come in and closed these bridges. I mean, that's going to be a key piece of legislation that will be voted on in the coming days in the Senate, and probably won't be decided till the final days of the session. That's when the bond bills are normally decided, but that's going to be a key issue going forward.
And finally, the strangest occurrence from this past week.
Well, going back to Willie Simmons, as I said, he's the Senate Transportation Committee Chair. And last week, Thursday, I guess, he called up and passed a bill that non-controversial bill, but it was kind of significant to us. It was a bill naming Old Highway 45 from the interstate, from Interstate 22. I still call it US 78, but from 22 to the Tennessee line, calling it the Rockabilly Highway, Rockabilly
Way.
Rockabilly Way, because of you have Elvis Presley obviously was an influence in Northeast Mississippi, but a lot of other people along that roadway, from Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, some of the early rock and roll, rockabilly kind of led the way for rock and roll. And so he passed that legislation that's expected to be a tourism boost for the area of the state. And then I thought everything was hunky-dory. He was heading to the governor. Then at the last minute, he holds on a motion to reconsider, meaning the bill can't leave the Senate until he tables that motion. And he has to be the one to table it. Only he can do that and call it to be tabled. And so he's fighting with the House held a bunch of his bills on a motion to reconsider. The House Transportation Committee Chair Charles Busby, because he said he blamed the Senate for killing the bill to provide money for the roads and bridges, and he said, and so Simmons had a bunch of bills named highways after people. He said that the highways were too bad to be named after anybody, so he held the Senate bills on a motion to reconsider. So Willie Simmons held a Rockabilly Way on a motion to be reconsidered. That's a House bill. So right now they're kind of holding these bills that's normally not held. These bills that just name highways after people, they're holding those on motions to reconsider. I figured to be resolved this week, but right now the Rockabilly Way is at least in a little jeopardy.
Well, just across the Tennessee line, I believe 45 is called the Rockabilly Highway, a segment of it. I can't remember because I go up that way all the time to go to St. Louis to see family, and I want to say it's around Selmer or going into Jackson maybe. So this would kind of be a continuation of that.
Right. They want to merge. The people who came up with this want to merge it, and up there, I think Carl Perkins was a
yep.
And so it would all just kind of merge together, and that's the hopes, and I'm sure before the deadline that Simmons will table a motion to reconsider on that bill and it pass and go into the governor, and there'll be signs up maybe by the summer highlighting Rockabilly Way.
Cool. All right. Well, that's it for this episode of Capitol View. Again, we come to you every Monday around 2 p.m. or maybe shortly after, depending on how our equipment is behaving and on our competency level with said equipment. But if you miss it or just want to watch it again, just watch the replay there at djournal.com. So thank you all for tuning in. You can follow Bobby on Twitter at Bobby Harrison9 and look for his work every day in the Daily Journal and at djournal.com. So that's it for Capitol View on this Monday, the 6th of March. We'll see you next week.